We're going to conclude this lecture by considering the last of the three arguments that Rachel offers in the chapter against ethical egoism. And this is the argument that Rachel himself advocates as the best argument. And he evaluates this argument as the best argument because he thinks it provides us with reasons that ethical egoism is likely to be false, and it also helps us to understand why it is that ethical egoism is false, what principle it violates that makes it a bad ethical theory. So he calls this argument the argument that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. So how does this argument go? Well, the first premise there is an assumption of what he calls the principle of equal treatment. And it prescribes that we should treat people in the same way unless there's a good reason not to. In other words, everybody should be treated in the same fashion unless there's a principled and relevant reason why they should be treated differently. So, for example, right, everybody who is 16 in the United States has the possibility of obtaining a driver's license and thereby being allowed to drive legally. Now, there are principled reasons why people can't obtain a driver's license. If, say, they've been convicted of violations, if they are not U.S. citizens, in some states anyway, and so on. But as long as there aren't those principled reasons why they should be treated differently, we should allow them to get a driver's license. Right? If you went to the DMV and you said, I want a driver's license, and they said, no, you can't get one, you said, why? And they said, 'cause, that would strike you as unacceptably arbitrary. That would be morally blameworthy on their part. And so that's the idea behind this first premise, this principle that we should treat people equally unless there's a principled reason to treat them differently. Ethical egoism, the second premise claims, requires that agents treat themselves differently from other people. So ethical egoism tells us, commands us, requires of us that we always act in ways that maximize our self-interest. And many times those actions are going to maximize our self-interest by treating us as more important than other people. So the guy who sells watered-down cancer drugs is maximizing his self-interest, but he's doing so in a way that treats his interests as more important than the interests of those cancer patients that he is defrauding. And so ethical egoism seems to violate that first principle, the principle of equal treatment. But maybe there's an adequate reason in those cases where ethical egoism prescribes this unequal treatment. And premise 3 says there isn't. Premise 3 says ethical egoism can provide no adequate reason to justify that unequal treatment. So if you ask the ethical egoist, why should you consider your interest to be more important than the interests of everyone else, the ethical egoist is going to say, 'cause, the same way that the DMV person would. There is no principled reason why you're more important than other people, why your interests have a greater value than other people that emerges out of ethical egoism. It just commands that. It doesn't motivate it. It doesn't provide a rationale or a principled reason why that would be true. And so ethical egoism violates that principle of equal treatment, and it does so in a way that doesn't give us any adequate or morally relevant reason to suppose that that unequal treatment is reasonable, is moral, is justifiable. As a result, line 4, ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. That is, it violates that principle of fair treatment, and it does so in a way that is unacceptably arbitrary. It doesn't provide us with any principled, motivated, morally relevant reason for why we value one person over another, one set of desires or goals or interests above another set of desires, goals, or interests. Since ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary, ethical egoism is likely a false view about normative ethical behavior. It's likely a false theory about how we should regulate our actions in the moral or ethical realm. So as I say, Rachel likes this argument the best. He thinks this is the best argument. And he thinks it's the best argument in part because it gives us reasons to suppose that ethical egoism is false, and in part because it reveals why ethical egoism looks like a bad theory. It looks like a bad theory precisely because it seems to violate one of the most fundamental suppositions of that minimum conception of morality, namely that we need to have moral judgments that encode principles that everyone can accept as reasonable. And part of accepting those principles as reasonable is that we see that there are good reasons for them, and part of those good reasons are that they treat us as fairly as they treat other individuals. That any difference in how we get treated is principled and morally relevant. So our principles are impartial in the minimum conception of morality, and that's part of the reason why they have normative force. They can guide our ethical behavior, and ethical egoism just lacks that. It just violates that minimum conception of morality in ways that are unacceptable. Hence, Rachel thinks it demonstrates that ethical egoism is likely false, and it provides us with an understanding of what's wrong with it as an ethical theory. In our last lecture for this week, we'll look at a chapter from a book by the science author Matt Ridley. And that book will look at descriptive facts about reciprocity. And so it'll look at whether or not we in fact have selfish reasons to act altruistically, and it'll look at whether or not evolution seems to select us for having altruistic motivations or altruistic intentions in our initial interactions with people.